I'm really delighted to be able to welcome you here today on behalf of Chris Roberto and myself and the California International Law Center. It's a delight to welcome you. So, Edward Snowden has been called, according to Wikipedia, a hero, a whistleblower, a dissident, a patriot, and a traitor. And we know that his revelations in June 2013 shook the world. They caused the United States to reconsider our own laws. In fact, led to legislative change here at home. It caused the rest of the world to reconsider their relationships with the United States and each other. Ben WIZNER became Edward Snowden's lawyer in July of 2013, a month after the revelations. Ben is the director of the ACLU's Speech, Privacy, and Technology project. He has been working at the intersection of issues of civil liberties and national security for the last 15 years at the ACLU. He is a graduate of Harvard College and New York University Law School, and he clerked on the Ninth Circuit for Judge Stephen Reinhardt. I just want to say, for me at least, and I know for many of you and for many of us in the room, I can say unequivocally that Ben is a hero to us. Let's welcome Ben WIZNER.
Thanks for that embarrassingly generous introduction, but even more thanks to all of you for sharing your lunch hour with me today. I'm going to speak for a little while, but I'm more looking forward to the back and forth that we'll have for the second half of this hour. The subject of the conversation today is democracy in an era of mass surveillance. I think you'll find that the more typical framing for this kind of discussion would be privacy in an era of mass surveillance, but for reasons that we'll get into. I think privacy is too small and too inadequate a word for the kinds of concerns we should have when governments have the capability to record and store nearly complete records of our lives. Privacy does not fully capture what's at stake. Now, I'm not going to start with Edward Snowden, but we'll get there, I promise. I'm going to start in 1971. In that year, a group of anti-war activists who called themselves the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI broke into an FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia. They stole all of the files and put them in a suitcase. They made copies and they mailed them to reporters from various newspapers, including the Washington Post, which published them over the strenuous objection of the FBI. Now, these documents offer proof of what many activists had long feared, that the FBI was engaged in widespread domestic surveillance targeting anti-war groups, black student organizations, and other perceived dissidents from J. Edgar Hoover's crabbed vision of America. Now, one of these documents actually said that FBI agents should, quote, enhance the paranoia among activists and, quote, get the point across that there is an FBI agent behind every mailbox. Another document referred cryptically to a program called COINTELPRO. Now, that single word in that single document spelled the beginning of the end of the Hoover era. Through litigation under the Freedom of Information Act, journalists and the public came to learn what COINTELPRO was. Now, COINTELPRO stands for Counterintelligence Program. It was a program launched by the FBI in 1956 to expose, disrupt, and otherwise neutralize, their words, a large number of organizations, old and new left, anti-war, black activists, American Indian, women's groups, and others, using tactics that were almost too grotesque to be believed in a democracy. As part of this program, the FBI would send poison pen letters to break up marriages among dissidents. There were incitements by the FBI to gang warfare. Members of a violent group were falsely labeled as police informants, putting their lives at risk. the Bureau attempted to persuade Reverend Martin Luther King, the target of what seems to have been the most sustained COINTELPRO program, to commit suicide just before he traveled to Oslo in 1964 to collect the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, the members of the Citizens Commission, the ones who liberated these documents from the FBI, were never caught. 4 decades after the event, most of them came forward to identify themselves and to tell their story, which is recounted in a book that I strongly recommend by the Washington Post reporter who first wrote this story, Betty Metzger. The book is called The Burglary, and there's a corresponding documentary called 1971, I believe. You can watch on iTunes. Right, Apple reviews, isn't it? Now, many people have pointed out the parallels between the media FBI break-in and the actions of Edward Snowden a few years ago. In both cases, a dramatic act of law-breaking pulled back the curtain to reveal a world quite different from the one we thought we lived in, and at the same time reinvigorated the rule of law and democratic oversight. In both cases, the government justified its controversial surveillance policies as a necessary defense of the nation against wartime threats. Then, of course, it was the Cold War, now the so-called global war on terror, or whatever they call it these days. Both of these episodes involved larger-than-life government bureaucrats who used a combination of charm and threat to amass power and to bend legal rules. Now, the last one, of course, was Hoover himself, who became the director of the FBI at the ripe young age of 29 and held that position for 50 years. Imagine in a democracy having a head of the secret police for half a century. It's kind of staggering to think about. Presidents were afraid of Hoover. He used the resources of the FBI and its claim to omniscience to smear and blackmail anyone bold enough to criticize his practices. In the recent NSA story, we see the figure of Keith Alexander, the former director of the NSA, who held that position until 2014. I recommend to you an extraordinary profile of General Alexander in Foreign Policy magazine by a journalist named Shane Harris. It describes Alexander's strategy to collect it all. This was his mantra. In the words of a former administration official who worked with the general, if he became the repository for all of this information, he believed that the resources and authorities would follow. In other words, if Keith Alexander could collect all of this information and show its utility, he would get the money that he needed from Congress, and the law would be reshaped or reinterpreted to accommodate his practices. Now, Alexander was a uniquely skilled bureaucrat. And I know that bureaucrat is usually a term that's used pejoratively, but I don't mean it that way. He created a headquarters that he named the Information Dominance Center. And this is from Shane Harris's profile. Quote, "It had been designed by a Hollywood set designer to mimic the bridge of the Starship Enterprise from Star Trek, complete with chrome panels, computer stations, a huge TV monitor on the forward wall, and doors that made a whoosh sound when they slid open and closed." Lawmakers and other important officials took turns sitting in a leather captain's chair in the center of the room and watched as Alexander, a lover of science fiction movies, showed off his data tools on the big screen. Now, J. Edgar Hoover's threats to policymakers were crude. Alexander's were subtle. Where Hoover's method was blackmail, Alexander's was political fear. Which senator wanted to be the one who denied him the budget or the authority that he asked for, knowing that that senator might be blamed in the event of a future terrorist attack? Now, I can already anticipate some of the objections. Whatever you might think of Keith Alexander, he was no J. Edgar Hoover, and that's true. Ordinarily, when we think about threats to democracy, we think about a federal spy agency keeping records on members of Congress, about presidents ordering the FBI to wiretap Supreme Court justices. These things actually happen. In other words, about the targeted subversion of checks and balances that J. Edgar Hoover represented. But what I intend to argue today is that modern technology has liberated the security state from those vulgar methods. A little bit more on that later. But first, I want to focus on what I think is the most important similarity between the 1970s surveillance debate and the events of 2013. Both produced what we might call constitutional moments. These all too rare times in our politics where there's a broad discussion about whether government practices have somehow outgrown or outpaced constitutional constraints. Both episodes specifically revealed a Fourth Amendment in need of some updating, and a government that had driven a truck through a loophole. Now, in 1970s, that loophole was the doctrine that the Fourth Amendment was inapplicable to foreign intelligence surveillance, even if that foreign intelligence surveillance took place on US soil, and even if it targeted US persons and US citizens. The result, as we know now, was hundreds of thousands of intelligence files maintained on US citizens, virtually none of whom had any ties to any foreign enemies or organizations. Today's loophole is a little bit more subtle. It's the legal doctrine that the collection of metadata has no constitutional significance, even on a mass scale. And more broadly, the government's argument that it can seize and store whatever data it wants without having to satisfy any constitutional standard, so long as there are rules in place later that govern the review of that data by human beings. So how should we properly understand this constitutional moment? In many ways, I think it's more complex than the debates of the 1970s. We're going to need to do more than eliminate a narrow exception to the Fourth Amendment. We're going to have to understand the ways in which technological progress poses new challenges to core constitutional values, and not just privacy, as I said earlier. Now, in 2013, when Edward Snowden introduced himself to the world in a video that was posted on the Guardian newspaper's website, he described the NSA's surveillance capabilities as an architecture of oppression. Now, oppression is a loaded word. Let's step back from that for a moment and consider the architecture of surveillance that surrounds us, most of which was not built by the NSA or by the intelligence agencies, but can be easily exploited by them. Fundamentally, we used to be able to live in practical obscurity. Most of our activities, I know some of you don't believe this, were unobserved and unrecorded, except by those around us. We now, of course, live in a world of near universal tracking. And let's consider this thing. It seems to be in the news these days. I confess that I'm old enough to be able to say that I did not have one of these until after I finished law school. What that means is that when my apartment burned down in New York during my first year of law school, I had to get a voicemail box. And in order to retrieve my messages, I would go into a phone booth, put in a quarter, call a number, and retrieve my messages. Now this thing, this isn't even a phone, right? The New York Times had an article a couple of years ago that said we shouldn't even call these things phones anymore. We should just call them trackers. It's a tracker, it's a computer, right? Not only is it recording and storing your location wherever you take it, it holds many of the most intimate details of your life. No surprise, really, that this little guy is the battleground right now between the deep state and the world's most profitable corporation. There's a lot at stake in this thing. But the phone is really just one example among countless that we can give about how what I described as practical obscurity has given way to universal tracking. Right? We used to write letters and postcards. We now send emails and texts, which, unless you are very technologically adept, are likely to be stored for a very long time, and which can come back to bite you, even if you yourself are never suspected of wrongdoing. Just ask Professor David Petraeus. Remember, he was not being investigated. One woman sent a nasty anonymous email to a second woman. She went to the FBI, and within days, the FBI was pouring through thousands of David Petraeus' private email addresses. Not that he turns out to be the most sympathetic figure, but it's a cautionary tale if even the CIA director can't protect himself from that kind of consequence. Now, of course, some of us at least, used to browse aimlessly in bookstores or in record stores, And of course, the online equivalents of these involve companies tracking and recording every page or item that we click on, even those that we don't purchase. Of course, we used to take photographs and drop off the film at the drugstore to be developed, and now we're uploading billions of photos each month to social media platforms, which are working hard to develop more precise facial recognition capabilities. Like, how far are we from a day when our glasses will be able to look at a person in the room and call up a detailed profile that may or may not be accurate? One more very critical point. All of this information that's being collected is being stored. Now, it used to be that storage was quite expensive. I read somewhere that the cost of a gigabyte of storage in 1980 was about $100,000, and I think now it's probably less than a few pennies to store that amount. And what it means is that for the first time in human history, it's now technologically and financially feasible for governments to record virtually all of our movements, our communications, and our associations, and to store that information for later analysis. Because surveillance used to be expensive and resource intensive, again, living this life of practical obscurity was the norm, or you might say the default setting. Today, it's virtually impossible to opt out of tracking. And it's this capability that is driving ambitious securocrats like Keith Alexander to push legal limits. Let's collect it all, they say. Let's show the value of this information, and let's let the law catch up with our practices, rather than having our practices be constrained by the law. And I believe that over time, these capabilities will represent as profound a threat to constitutional government as the crude abuses of the Hoover era. Justice Sonia Sotomayor put it well in her concurrence in the United States versus Jones case, in which the court held for the first time that GPS tracking constituted a Fourth Amendment search. And she wrote, "By making available at a relatively low cost such a substantial quantum of intimate information about any person whom the government in its unfettered discretion chooses to track, these practices may, in her words, alter the relationship between citizen and government in a way that is inimical to democratic society." Where a goon like Hoover needed to send teams of agents to compile his dangerous dossiers, General Alexander could assemble massive databases of ruin at the press of a button from his leather captain's chair. And while we knew before Edward Snowden that the government had been building these capabilities, we did not know how widely they had already been unleashed. Now, defenders of current bulk collection practices insist, and I believe generally in good faith, that these comparisons between the Hoover era and today's NSA are grossly unfair and misleading. There's a material difference, they argue, between FBI agents assembling files on targeted individuals and passive collection systems that sweep up vast quantities of information and store it, with strict rules governing human access to that data. Now, I won't discuss today how strict those rules actually are and how often they've been broken. Today, I want us to consider a different question. How confident are we that those rules and safeguards will survive a national trauma? Look at what I consider to be the irrational and hyperventilating responses to recent terrorist attacks here and in Europe. Legislators throughout the Western world have been tripping over each other to propose new surveillance authorities, impose states of emergency, as in France, to oppose any limits on existing authority, even though, as usual, most of the attackers were already well known to multiple intelligence agencies. How robust will the rules that limit access be in the face of another major terrorist attack here, especially when it will be shown conclusively that the evidence that would have foiled the plot was in the government's databases, but off limits to its investigators? Because if we're going to collect all the dots, they're going to connect in hindsight. And this, I think, is what Snowden was worrying about when he warned about turnkey tyranny. But even if you don't share the view that our democratic system might be so easily or dramatically switched off, and I don't, history tells us that the lockbox that safeguards all of this private information will be unlocked. Any realistic assessment of the dangers of mass surveillance has to do more than take a snapshot of today. It has to make a clear-eyed prediction about tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. And it's reasonable to assume that the surveillance time machine that the NSA is now assembling will, over time, be increasingly available to the FBI, to the Drug Enforcement Agency, to Joint Terrorism Task Forces, and ultimately to any local law enforcement officer. That world is going to feel very different from the world that we live in today. Bruce Schneier likes to say, think about how you act and feel when a police car is driving right alongside you. Now imagine living your entire life with that feeling. But let's also keep in mind that the question the Constitution asks is not whether the government has the proper internal safeguards on who can obtain access to a database. As Chief Justice Roberts wrote in a related context, the founders did not fight a revolution to gain the right to government agency protocols. Now, you don't hear the defenders of the security state very often invoking the founders of the Constitution, the framers, and that's for good reason. Because the people who wrote the Constitution and Bill of Rights would have been appalled by a political discourse that subordinated hard-won rights to talismanic invocations of national security, a term they would not even have recognized. It's actually an interesting thought experiment. What would the framers of the Constitution have made of somebody like Keith Alexander if they'd been invited to sit in on one of his Star Trek data displays? I think they would have listened to him blathering about the information age and about increasing the efficiency of data collection, and they would have said, no, 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 you have the whole thing wrong. The Constitution was supposed to make the government less efficient, not more. Read the Bill of Rights. The Fourth Amendment. You can't search or seize without a warrant supported by probable cause of wrongdoing. The Fifth Amendment. You can't force people to be witnesses against themselves. You don't get 2 bites at the apple. You can't take their freedom or their property without some kind of fair process. The Sixth Amendment. Everybody gets a lawyer and a public trial by jury and to confront evidence against them. The Eighth Amendment. You can't beat evidence out of them. The only way to read these words that were written more than 200 years ago is that their authors were more worried about a government with too much power than they were about a bad guy who might get away. And this, to me, is what's so frustrating about so much of the current debate about civil liberties and state security. It's become standard to approach the debate as if our challenge is to set the dial in precisely the right place that most efficiently maximizes both values. But that ignores that the framers of the Constitution already put their thumbs on the scale, and for a good reason. There's a reason why, in the Fourth Amendment, suspicion of wrongdoing comes before search. And it's not only because of the presumption that we should generally be left alone, but because of the danger that a government with enough data about any of us can find some basis for being suspicious. Show me the man, and I will show you the crime, said Stalin's secret police chief. Now, the good news, the green shoots that I will end on, and then we'll have a nice conversation, is that I do believe that courts and legislatures are waking up to the challenge that surveillance technologies pose to constitutional rights. In 2 of the last 4 Supreme Court terms, we've seen unanimous decisions by the Supreme Court that reinvigorate the Fourth Amendment in the digital age. One holding that prolonged GPS tracking is a Fourth Amendment search. The second, that if the police want to search this thing incident to an arrest, they have to get a warrant, as the sticker says. State legislatures around, though a sticker came before the ruling. State legislatures around the country have been enacting new strong privacy protections, for example, requiring police to get a warrant before tracking the location of a phone. And so the states, including California, are ahead of the federal government, ahead of the federal courts, and ahead of the Congress in that regard. But I think it's a trend that's going to make its way to Washington. But even Congress, in 2015, for the first time since 1978, enacted bipartisan legislation in Congress, which doesn't enact any legislation, that restricted at least one NSA bulk collection program with a rationale that should make the NSA worried about other of their bulk collection programs. But lest we be too confident, we can look at the current election season, which should remind us that no victory, however hard won or hard fought, is permanent. That democracy is not something that we just inherit or enjoy, but something that we have to fight for and preserve. And I'll end with a quote that I really like from the former Supreme Court Justice of Israel, Aaron Barak, who put it extremely well. He said, "If we do not protect democracy, democracy will not protect us." And thank you very much for your patience and attention, and I'd be glad to take any questions.